All right, Challenge. I hope I haven't started before 1 minute. Challenge, inshallah, let's resume. This so ecosystem. Apart from the definition of the ecosystem, these are 2 points that we've seen. There's one more point that I want to talk about ecosystem before we proceed to the further idea. And that is, let's see, the others have joined. Challenge, the others will join. Okay, so the next thing that we are going to talk about is about ecosystem, and that let me write that point for you and then I will explain. Ecosystem is not completely self-contained. It's not completely self-contained. क्या मतलब? We need to understand this. देखें, when I say ecosystem is not completely self-contained, what does that mean? देखें, when you are looking at an environment in which there are a lot of organisms living and all of that stuff, uh, usually we assume that, or yani कि for example, if we are talking about birds, okay, I'm talking about a particular ecosystem at one particular area. Now, of course, we understand that in parts of the world, even that are close by, there are other ecosystems that also exist. I mean, we can't say that there's only one ecosystem. There are many ecosystems. Usually when we are studying this, we assume that ecosystem is just one unit. Yani कि, for example, agar ek ecosystem, there are some birds that belong to one ecosystem. Do you really think that these birds will only interact with that ecosystem? I'm specifically giving you an example of birds because they usually fly and they migrate, okay? So we have to understand that ecosystem is not a completely self-contained system, okay? Sorry. Organisms of one ecosystem are linked to the organisms of the other. So let me write that down. Organisms of one ecosystem are linked with other. Okay, and this can happen in terms of many things like predation, usually in terms of food chains and food web. In A level, we don't go in that detail, but I hope you remember back from O levels that what was food chain trophic levels and all of that feeding stuff. Okay, let me give you a very classical example. I don't know how many of you are fond of fish and machi in this mosam. मैं वैसे एक time पे हुआ करता था, लेकिन I don't know. I don't really like fish. तो आप जब भी कोई fish खाते हैं, I mean, it is coming, you don't know from which part of the world and which ecosystem is that coming. But you can clearly see that you as a human living in a particular ecosystem is actually feeding on that fish, which is maybe coming from another ecosystem altogether. So again, that's one of the examples how you can clearly see how ecosystems are not completely self-contained. To summarize, so far, let's look at the big picture. So we started off with the idea of species, okay? Then we went on to see what population is. Then we went on to see what a community is. And then we've talked about much about ecosystem and what basic things an ecosystem is supposed to have, okay? All right, now the next thing that we are going to talk about is known as an ecological niche or niche, whatever you want to call it, ecological niche. I will define it first the way it is traditionally supposed to be defined, and then I will explain. It is the role. Niche है? ये खतीजा आपको किसने बताया? नहीं जी,
मैंने खुद ही guess किया।
नीशे नहीं, अब आप इतनी भी चाइनीज ना बने ना, हौसला रखें, निच रहने दें, मतलब कोई जिस तरह चिटन को हमने चिटन रहने दिया और काइटन नहीं किया, वैसे ओरिजिनली इट्स सपोज टू बी काइटन, बट आई डोंट नो, आई लाइक द वे चिटन, इसी तरह इसको हम निच रहने देते हैं। नीशे मतलब कोई चाइनीज सूप का नाम लगता है वैसे, बाहर चलो बाहर। So it is the role, if you like, of an organism in an ecosystem. Role of an organism in an ecosystem. I know at first when you look at this definition, it looks very vague. Okay? Let me clearly explain what do I mean by this. Dekhen, I will pose 3 questions, rhetorical questions that will answer what do I mean when I say कि ecological niche क्या है, ठीक है? So niche, as some people are insisting, is how the organisms feed, how organisms feed. That's number one. Number two, how it behaves, how it behaves. Aggressive hai, is it aggressive, is it not aggressive, and so on and so forth. And number three, where it lives, where it lives. Okay, so that's a very classical example of what a niche is supposed to look like. I mean, these are the three basic things that would usually define a role of an organism in its ecosystem. Iske alawa, of course, how it behaves it can include नहीं बल्कि वो feeding असल में these are overlapped categories. Okay, maybe you can also consider the fourth point as the body size. Okay, body size can also be considered, and also let's add a fifth point also, locomotion. Okay, the way it moves. So all of these are yardsticks for us to understand what is a niche of an organism. और इसकी एक बहुत अच्छी example है. I really want to give that example. If you can just give me a minute. मैंने उसकी lesson से पहले तस्वीर save नहीं की. My bad. Wait. I was looking for good examples, okay? And wait, that's WeTransfer. No. Yeah, I think I did save it. I did save it. Okay, let me paste that picture and let me explain what that means. Okay, that's an A level. Pictures, biodiversity. नहीं मैंने उसकी. Okay, I actually didn't save that picture. बहरहाल मैं आपको एक example दे दूँ. I mean, just to give you an example, there is a beetle, okay? उसको क्या कहते हैं? कौन सी beetle कहते हैं? ठहरे जरा एक second. Research करने दो. बहुत अच्छी example है. Wait. But if you can just give me 10 seconds to quickly see. Okay, the name of that. मुझे याद नहीं आ रहा. इंशाल्लाह I think in my next class I will do this. I will give you an example. वो एक beetle है जो कि I don't exactly remember the name of that beetle, but there's this beetle, okay, which actually makes circles of cow dung. नहीं scarab नहीं है. Beetle मैं अभी lesson से पहले देख रहा था, मेरे ज़हन से नाम निकल गया. It's a beetle that actually makes rolls of cow dung and mud, और वो mix करके mud को और cow dung को basically makes balls of these, and that actually has a lot of role as far as the other parts of the ecosystem is concerned. For example, taking out so that's basically a mixture of cow dung, if I'm not wrong, and the sand. It makes balls of it and it actually takes it to its आपको पता है कि beetles and ants, their habitat is inside the mud and soil, and they dig burrows and they take them inside, and that actually prevents the flies from coming all over the cow dung. इस तरह flies की population भी manage होती है, and then it's good for the soil. So I mean, you can clearly see that the way it is behaving, it is living, that's the basic role of an organism. Let me give you another classical example. Tiger or lion का ecological niche क्या है? I mean, the thing that stands out for them is their aggressive way they feed and prey on animals. Okay, so that's basically how niche will be. But generally, you should just know this as an idea. मुझे बड़ा अफसोस हो रहा है, I can't find that example. It was such a lovely example, बस picture ही मैंने save नहीं की. चलें बाहर कोई बात नहीं. So that's basically the niche. Okay. Now, all of what I've talked about today is actually setting the context for understanding the name of the topic, which is biodiversity. मैं आपको आज सिर्फ I'm going to give you a hint about what exactly do we mean by biodiversity. Inshallah, then in our next class tomorrow, we will go into details of this, because again, that's a the detailed thing that we require. Now, when I say biodiversity, of course, as I said, bio has to do with something living, and we've seen a lot of categorization when it comes to these living things in terms of species, populations, community, and so on and so forth. And diversity, of course, is variety. But I think whilst I'm saying this, the next question that pops up in your mind is variety in terms of what? I mean, it's very vague for me to just say bas biodiversity hai jiska matlab variety hai, end of story. No, when I'm using the word biodiversity, I mean variety at three different levels. I mean variety at number one, genetic level. ठीक है जी. Number two, I mean variety in terms of the number of species in an ecosystem. And number three, when I'm using the word variety, I mean the diversity or the variety of habitats. So this is a classical take on explanation of what biodiversity is. We explain biodiversity in the context of these 3 points, or these 3 levels, if you like. So when I say an ecosystem has a very big biodiversity, I mean diversity in terms of genetics, I mean diversity in terms of number of species, and I mean diversity in terms of the variety of habitats. I want to go back to the specification and see, we've been able to only do 2 points today. Lekin, I want you to look at this thing very carefully, okay? So if you look at point number A, we have defined the terms species, ecosystem, and niche. And of course, all of the other terms that I've talked about, we had to talk about them in order for us to make sense of what ecosystem was and what niche was. Yes, you will hardly find instances in the past papers where the examiner will be insisting on definitions of population or community, but definitely for species, ecosystem, and niche, yes, there will be cases where you find that. Look at point number B. Point number B says, excuse me. Yes, explain that biodiversity is considered at 3 levels. I haven't gone into explanations today. I just gave you a bird's eye view that it is the biodiversity is understood at 3 different levels. The first one is, as you can see, the first bullet point of point B is variation in ecosystem or habitat. So that's the variety in terms of habitats, okay? We will talk about its detail, inshallah, tomorrow. Number 2, the number of species and their relative abundance. So that's a new word, relative abundance, species richness, के भी बारे में हम बात करेंगे, species evenness. So there are a lot of new terms that we will talk about when we, discuss this idea. And then number 3 is genetic variation. And this is an idea that we have been discussing since the past 2 lessons, okay? When we did meiosis, we studied the causes of genetic variation. When we were doing natural selection, we saw how the change in allele frequency eventually during the course of evolution is going to give you genetic variation, which is beneficial in the longer run, as Darwin proposed, the survival of the fittest and whatnot. ठीक है जी. So inshallah we're going to look at that all in detail tomorrow. मेरा plan तो था कि हम F भी देखेंगे. अब मैं आपको थोड़ा सा एक idea भी दे देता हूँ what F is. So inshallah tomorrow we can talk about that in detail. There's a mathematical or statistical, if you like, formula that actually quantifies the variety. मैं अगर आपसे पूछूं कि जी आपके गार्डन में बाहर कितनी वैरायटी है, what variety do you have in your garden? Maybe you can answer in terms of a sentence कि जी I have a lot of variety and so on and so forth. But if I were to ask you to give me a number, kitni, so for example, if you were to say the variety in my garden is 0.8, that sounds quite absurd. But this is what this formula is all about. It quantifies through this formula, the formula which you don't need to remember, don't worry. But we will see how we are actually quantifying the diversity using this Simpson's index of diversity. ठीक है जी. Thank you, bachcho. Inshallah, I'm stopping here today. Inshallah, we will continue from here tomorrow. Khadija, I want you to stay back. The others can leave. Thank you. अपना बहुत ख्याल रखें बच्चों. अल्लाह हाफिज. खतीजा आप जरा पीछे ही रहें. The others they